At last the screeching died away, and Grey Wing dared to stick his head out of the crack. The sky was clear. The eagle was nowhere to be seen. "Okay, we can leave," he mewed to Jagged Peak. Jagged Peak looked up at him with worried eyes. "What if the eagle's waiting for us?" "It's not. It's gone." Grey Wing squeezed into the open, and after a moment's hesitation Jagged Peak followed. He stood quietly, still shaking a little, while his brother checked him over, nosing carefully down one side and then the other. "You have a few scratches," Grey Wing announced at last, with a quiver of relief that it was no worse. "But you'll be fine." Anger surged up to replace his anxiety. "What were you thinking, leaving the cave like that, you little fuzzbrain?" Recovering rapidly from his fear, Jagged Peak faced him defiantly. "I wanted to go with the others. Quiet Rain had no right to stop me." "She's your mother," Grey Wing meowed. "She knows what's best for you." His eyes narrowing, Jagged Peak retreated a pace. "You haven't come to take me back, have you?" he asked. "Because I'm not going. I'll fight you if I have to." Grey Wing had to suppress an amused merow at the sight of his little brother, tail lashing and claws out. "Calm down," he sighed. "I won't make you go home. We're going to find the others." Jagged Peak's eyes widened in surprise. "But you wanted to stay," he objected. "You need me more than they do." Jagged Peak's shoulder fur fluffed up with renewed indignation. "I'm fine on my own," he declared. "You nearly got carried off by an eagle," Grey Wing pointed out. Jagged Peak waved his tail dismissively. "Well, I found the way down into the valley without falling." Grey Wing realized that there was no point in arguing. "We still have a long way to go before we're clear of the mountains," he continued. "Things could get even more dangerous." "We'll be okay," Jagged Peak asserted. "We have each other now. And did you see how I fought off that eagle? You'd have been chick feed if it wasn't for me." The little cat set off again, bounding over the boulders. Grey Wing followed more slowly, the pain from his neck and torn paw pad stabbing him like sharp thorns. The sun had vanished behind the mountains, and dusk was gathering around them. "We need to look for somewhere to shelter," he called to Jagged Peak. His brother halted and turned to look back at him. "I want to keep going," he mewed obstinately. "The others will be so far ahead by now." "It's too dangerous to travel in the dark," Grey Wing insisted. "There are still places to fall, even though we're in the bottom of the valley. Tomorrow we'll follow the ledge up there," he added, pointing with his ears. Jagged Peak looked as if he was about to argue, then gave in and dipped his head. Grey Wing led the way to a sheltered spot in a hollow between the roots of a scrubby tree. As he was scraping out some of the gritty earth to make the den bigger, he heard Jagged Peak's belly growl. "Are you hungry? Do you want to hunt?" he asked. Jagged Peak shook his head. "I'll be fine until morning," he mewed bravely. Grey Wing had given up expecting Jagged Peak to apologize for running away, but as they settled down in the hollow, the young cat nestled into his fur. "I'm glad you're here," Jagged Peak murmured drowsily. "I guess that's good enough," Grey Wing thought. Grey Wing woke to a cold, grey morning. Through the branches above his head he could see the sky was heavy with clouds, threatening more snow. Jagged Peak was curled into a tight ball with his tail wrapped over his nose, deeply asleep. The journey must be even more exhausting for such a small cat. Listening to his brother's snuffling breath, Grey Wing had to admit how brave Jagged Peak had been to leave the cave on his own, and to attack the eagle. "If he's this determined to find our new home, then I'll make sure he gets there." Soon Jagged Peak stirred and lifted his head, blinking sleepily. "Where's Mother?" he asked with a yawn. "Has she gone out hunting?" "You're not in the cave anymore," Grey Wing reminded him. "You stay here and wake up properly, while I go and see if I can find some prey." Clambering out of the hollow, he padded up the valley. Soon he spotted a mouse scuffling around in the debris under a thorn bush. At last, some good luck, he thought, springing to kill it. When he returned to their makeshift sleeping hollow, he found Jagged Peak sitting on a tree root, grooming himself. The little cat's eyes brightened as he saw the limp body dangling from his brother's jaws. "You got something," he exclaimed. "Yes, and it's all for you," Grey Wing meowed, ignoring his own grumbling belly as he dropped the prey in front of his brother. "You need to keep your strength up." Jagged Peak didn't need to be told twice. "Thanks," he mumbled, gulping the prey down in famished bites. His blue eyes sparkled as he swallowed the last mouthful and swiped his tongue around his jaws. "Today's going to be great," he exclaimed. "The others will be so surprised when we catch them." Grey Wing murmured agreement as he studied their surroundings, looking for the best route up to the rocky shelf. The clouds seemed thicker than ever, and the air smelled of snow. "We need to get up as high as we can, and quickly," he thought. "It's going to snow again, and we might get stuck in drifts." There was no obvious track. Grey Wing decided it was best to make straight for the ledge. "This way," he meowed, waving his tail for Jagged Peak to follow him. Once they set out, he found the ground wasn't as clear as he had hoped. They had to climb over boulders, and once they came to a wide stream chattering over stones. The edges were frozen, but there was a clear channel in the middle. Grey Wing leaped over it and turned to face Jagged Peak. "Jump as far as you can," he advised. "I'm here, ready to grab you." With a determined expression on his face, Jagged Peak backed away several poor steps, then bounded up to the bank of the stream and launched himself, letting out a squeal as he soared upward with his paws splayed out. He landed on the ice at the far side. Grey Wing heard it start to crack, and grabbed Jagged Peak by the scruff just before he fell into the swiftly running water. "Thanks." Jagged Peak gasped as he straightened up. "Hey," he added, "that was a good leap, wasn't it?" "It was fantastic," Grey Wing assured him. A little farther on, the ground began to rise steeply. Eventually they came to a halt in front of a sheer wall of rock that stretched as far as they could see in both directions. Jagged Peak gazed upward in dismay. "Now what do we do?" Grey Wing studied the rock face carefully, realizing that it wasn't as sheer as he had first thought. There were ledges, even if they were only as wide as a claw scratch, and crevices where clumps of grass had rooted themselves. "I think we can climb it," he mewed. Jagged Peak's eyes widened. "Are you fuzz-brained?" "I'm not climbing that." Grey Wing shrugged. "Okay, we go home." Jagged Peak hesitated for a moment, then, without another word, leaped onto the rock face and started clawing his way upward. Grey Wing watched, ready to break his fall. Grit and scraps of grass showered down on Grey Wing's head, but at last Jagged Peak reached the top. Grey Wing began to climb, digging his claws into the cracks and scrabbling strongly with his hind paws. He winced as sharp pain stabbed up his leg from his injured paw. There was one heart-stopping moment when he slipped, but he forced himself upward with all the strength in his legs until he stood beside Jagged Peak on the slope above the cliff. From here, Grey Wing could see a clear track zigzagging in the direction of the ledge they were making for. "Come on," he meowed as he headed off, setting a brisk pace. He assumed that Jagged Peak was following him until he heard a plaintive, "Hey, Grey Wing," from some way behind. He looked back to see his brother plodding to catch up. "We haven't got all day for you to dawdle," he commented. "I'm not dawdling," Jagged Peak protested indignantly. "My legs are shorter than yours." Grey Wing realized that his brother was right. Not only did Jagged Peak have shorter legs, but his muscles were soft from living in the cave all his life. "Okay, I'll slow down," he sighed, picturing the other cats drawing farther and farther ahead. Trying to match his brother's pace, Grey Wing felt impatience rising inside him. When they reached a large rock blocking the track, he grabbed Jagged Peak unceremoniously by the scruff and hauled him over the obstacle. Jagged Peak twitched his whiskers as Grey Wing set him down. "I could have gotten over that by myself. We wouldn't have to do this at all if it wasn't for you." Grey Wing bit back the words he wanted to say. Jagged Peak stalked up the track, his tail high in the air. As he followed, Grey Wing noticed that the first flakes of snow were beginning to fall. He quickened his pace until he was padding beside Jagged Peak again. "We must find shelter," he meowed. Let's try that boulder up there. The place he pointed out was only a few tail lengths away, but by the time he and Jagged Peak reached it, the snow was already falling heavily, and the wind was blustering around the rocks, making Grey Wing afraid that his lighter brother would be blown off his paws. He shoved Jagged Peak into the narrow gap between the boulder and the mountainside, and scrambled in after him tail first. Gazing out of the cleft, he saw that everything had been blotted out by a screen of driving snow. "We're never going to find the others," Jagged Peak muttered fearfully, peering out over his brother's shoulder. "We might even freeze to death." "We won't," Grey Wing assured him, his irritation vanishing. "And the others won't get too far ahead in this weather." He hoped he was right. Jagged Peak curled up and closed his eyes. Shortly afterward, his light snores told Grey Wing that he was asleep. Grey Wing finally dozed off, dreaming he was pursuing the other cats over endless mountain peaks, sometimes picking up a scent trace but never managing to catch them. He jerked awake when Jagged Peak prodded him in the side. "Look!" his brother exclaimed. "The snow has stopped." Grey Wing blinked in the dazzling light. The sky had cleared and the sun shone down on the fresh, untouched expanse of white. His eyes widened in dismay as he realized that the blizzard had completely transformed the landscape. The track they had been following was covered, and so was the ledge they had been headed for. While he was still trying to work out their route, Jagged Peak pushed past him and bounded enthusiastically into the snow. The surface gave way beneath him and he was floundering in a drift, letting out squeaks of alarm. Grey Wing approached him cautiously, managing to find firm ground under the white covering, and stretched out his neck to grab Jagged Peak by the scruff. "Next time, don't go dashing off," he warned, as he set his brother down beside him. The kit shook himself vigorously so that melting snow spattered over Grey Wing, who shivered. "Listen, Jagged Peak, you need to watch where you're putting your paws. If you look carefully, you can see the shapes of rocks under the snow. That's how you'll know it's safe to walk there. And if you can't see any rocks, then test the snow as deep as you can with one paw before you put your weight on it." "I understand," Jagged Peak meowed. The next stage of their climb was slow and exhausting. Grey Wing thought he could remember where the ledge should be, and led the way toward it, testing each paw step and struggling to find a safe route around boulders that lay in their way. Eventually the boulders thinned out and a flat stretch of snow lay in front of the two cats. He tested the first few paw steps and discovered hard earth a little way down. At last, Grey Wing thought, somewhere easy to run across. He launched himself onto the white expanse, relishing the chance to stretch his muscles and the feeling of the wind rushing through his pelt. "Come on, keep up," he called behind to Jagged Peak. Without warning, the snowy surface gave way beneath Grey Wing's paws. He let out a screech as he plunged into icy water. Paddling furiously, managing to keep his head clear, he tried to climb out, but the snow around him was deep and slushy, and broke away when he tried to put his weight on it. Grey Wing had fallen into a stream, which was carrying him slowly down the mountainside. Fighting to stay afloat, he looked around for Jagged Peak. The little cat was running along the bank, his eyes wide with panic. "What can I do?" he wailed. Grey Wing looked around, trying to stay calm as his legs weakened. Bitter claws of cold gripped him. A little farther down the mountain, he spotted a branch sticking out of the snow, and guessed it had been carried there when the stream was in flood. "See that branch?" he called. "Push one end of it toward me." Jagged Peak bounded ahead and began struggling to drag the branch out of the snow. Grey Wing waited as he was carried down toward it. He was so cold now that he couldn't feel his legs, and his soaked pelt dragged at him. "If this doesn't work, I'm buzzard food." "That's right," he meowed as Jagged Peak freed the branch. "Now push it across the stream. Keep it anchored, though." Slowly Jagged Peak dragged the branch until it stuck out across the stream. He crouched down on the other end, using all his weight to hold it still, his claws dug firmly into it. Grey Wing felt a stab of terror as the current surge carried him to the branch, and almost dragged him past it. Forcing his aching limbs to move, he stretched to grab the end with his teeth. Jagged Peak backed away from the edge of the stream, tugging determinedly at the branch. In the midst of his fear, Grey Wing felt a flash of admiration for his brother's sturdy strength and courage. The little cat went on struggling, pulling Grey Wing out of the slush. Grey Wing paddled desperately with his legs until he felt firm ground underneath him. Once he was sure he was safe, Grey Wing collapsed, drenched and freezing. For a moment he couldn't move. Then through a fog of fatigue he realized that Jagged Peak was licking him with strong tongue strokes, just as Quiet Rain had done when they were kits. He felt his brother stretching to curl himself around his body. With a long sigh, Grey Wing relaxed, feeling Jagged Peak's rough, comforting tongue until his fur dried and warmth crept through his body. At last Grey Wing felt revived enough to sit up. "I thought you were going to die," Jagged Peak mewed, his eyes wide and scared. "I'm fine," Grey Wing responded. "Thanks to you." Embarrassment crawled through his pelt at the thought that he had to be rescued. "I can't believe I ran across that open space, after all I said to Jagged Peak." Not wanting to go near the snowbound stream again, Grey Wing headed directly upward, testing the snow cautiously with every paw step to make sure that they stayed on the bank. "Look!" Jagged Peak's scared voice came from just behind. Turning, Grey Wing saw that another eagle was hovering lazily overhead. And there was nowhere to hide. The snow-covered slope was smooth, without even a boulder poking above its surface. Grey Wing glanced upward again. The eagle didn't seem to have spotted them yet, but it wouldn't be long before its piercing gaze picked them out. "I know," he gasped, shivering with relief as an idea came to him. "We'll dig scoops in the snow and bury ourselves." The eagle had flown higher up the mountain, skimming the surface as it cast about for prey with its beady gaze. Knowing they only had heartbeats to hide themselves, Grey Wing dug furiously at the snow and shoved Jagged Peak inside. "I'll suffocate," Jagged Peak protested as Grey Wing scooped snow on top of him. "You won't. Now shut up and keep still." With no time to dig another hole for himself, Grey Wing crouched down and burrowed into the drift until he felt as if he was fully covered. Claws of cold pierced his pelt. He had to clench his teeth to stop them from chattering in case the eagle heard. His ears were muffled with snow, but he could see the shadow of the bird swoop over them. "Nothing for you here," he thought, holding his breath. "Just keep going." The shadow slid away over the white surface until Grey Wing couldn't see it anymore. He waited for as long as he could bear before bursting out of his hole. His bones felt like sticks of ice as he scanned the sky, letting out a sigh of relief when he saw it was clear. Still checking for movement above his head, Grey Wing turned to where he had buried his brother and began scraping snow away. Jagged Peak scrambled out, shaking clots of snow from his pelt. "Is it gone?" "For now. Come on, we should run to warm ourselves, and find a better place in case the eagle comes back." On numb, stumbling legs the two cats staggered up the slope. At first, all Grey Wing could think about was finding somewhere to hide, and when at last he paused to look around, he realized that they had climbed much higher than the ledge they had been headed toward. The jagged rocks of the ridge were only a few tail lengths away. "I'm sorry," he panted to Jagged Peak. "We've come too far." Jagged Peak looked up at the ridge, his eyes bright with excitement. "We might as well keep going to the top," he mewed. "I've never been so high." Grey Wing let out a faint purr, understanding the little cat's excitement. "Okay, let's do it," he agreed. Wind buffeting their fur, the two cats hauled themselves up sheer rock and onto a tiny pinnacle, with barely enough space for them to stand side by side. "Wow!" Jagged Peak breathed out. He gazed round-eyed at summit after summit rolling away on all sides. "I never knew there were so many mountains. I didn't know the world was as big as this." Stretching up, he added, "Can we see the waterfall from here?" "No," Grey Wing replied. "We've come too far. I think it must be hidden behind that crag over there." He pointed with one paw. Turning in the other direction, toward the sunrise, Grey Wing felt a tingle of excitement in his fur. "Somewhere out there is our new home, just like Stone Teller promised. And we're going to find it." Jagged Peak let out a sudden squeal, startling Grey Wing so much that he almost lost his balance on the pinnacle. "What?" he demanded. "Another eagle?" "No. I can see the others." Grey Wing squinted at where Jagged Peak was pointing, and made out a line of tiny shapes on the side of the valley, a long way ahead. "Come on." Jagged Peak was bouncing up and down precariously. "Let's go." "Calm down before you fall," Grey Wing told him. "We have to plan our route carefully. It's too windy and exposed up here, so we'll need to head down, but forward as well, so we can catch up to them." Side by side, the two cats studied the terrain. To Grey Wing's relief, there was more cover in the direction they needed to go. "Why not head for that fallen tree?" Jagged Peak suggested, pointing with his tail at a tangle of dead branches poking up out of the snow. "Okay," Grey Wing agreed, impressed that the young cat had such a good idea of the best route, with cover from dangerous birds. "But let me take the lead." "Just as long as you don't fall in any hidden streams," Jagged Peak meowed, his eyes sparkling. This time they made better progress, hopping over boulders and treading carefully where the snow concealed slopes of loose scree. Before they had gone very far, Jagged Peak halted. "I smell prey," he announced. Grey Wing glanced at him in surprise, sure at first that his brother must be wrong. He couldn't see anything, but, after a moment, he picked up a very faint scent trail. "Wow, you're good at this," he told Jagged Peak. "You'd better track it." He admired how his brother instinctively dropped into the correct crouch, and his light steps as he followed the scent trail. Grey Wing watched as the younger cat crept closer to a small pile of stones. A small mountain shrew shot out of the heap. Jagged Peak pounced, piercing it with his sharp claws. "I got it!" he exclaimed in astonishment, as if he couldn't believe his success. He bent down to take one bite and then pushed the rest of it over to Grey Wing. "You caught it," Grey Wing protested. "You should eat it." Jagged Peak shook his head firmly. "We share," he mewed. "That's the proper way to behave." Grey Wing dug in, then swiped his tongue around his jaws to catch the last juices. "Thanks," he purred. "I feel so much better now." The next stretch of their journey meant slithering down a tricky stretch of boulders, where small stones skidded from beneath their paws. Grey Wing was thankful to come to a halt on a narrow ledge that led in the direction they wanted to go. Then, as he drew in a breath, he realized that a familiar scent was bathing his muzzle. Jagged Peak picked it up at the same moment. "This is the path the others took," he exclaimed, sounding as thrilled as if they had caught up with their friends already. "Don't get too excited," Grey Wing warned, though his own paws were tingling. "There's still a good way to go." The sun was behind them, casting long shadows ahead as it sank behind the mountaintops. "We need to stop and find shelter for the night," Grey Wing meowed. "No," Jagged Peak objected. "I want to keep going. We might not be able to see, but I can follow the scent trail." He closed his eyes tightly and padded along the ledge with his nose to the surface of the snow. Grey Wing darted to one side, ready to catch him in case he came too close to the edge, but the kit walked confidently, his tail held high. "See," Jagged Peak mewed at last, halting and opening his eyes again. Grey Wing gave in to his desire to find the other cats. "Okay, but we have to stop if it starts feeling too risky." Jagged Peak nodded eagerly, then set off in the lead. The night was cloudy, and although the moon was still close to full, it only shone fitfully. There were times when Grey Wing couldn't see his own whiskers. Jagged Peak headed along the ledge, slowly and carefully, seeming certain of where the scent trail was leading him. Grey Wing followed a paw step behind, until suddenly he bumped into his brother. "What's the matter?" he asked. "I'm not sure," Jagged Peak responded. In the dim light, Grey Wing could just make out that Jagged Peak was casting around as if he had lost the scent. At last he straightened up. "The trail veers off here," he announced. Grey Wing paused before replying, wondering if this was the point when they should stop and wait for daylight. But he knew Jagged Peak would argue. "Let's follow it then," he mewed at last. "But be very careful." Jagged Peak led the way a short distance up the mountain, then began doubling back toward the ledge. "What's going on?" Grey Wing asked, with a hiss of annoyance as he set his injured paw down on a sharp stone. "Why not just go straight along the ledge? It would be a lot easier." "I don't know," said Jagged Peak as the stones gave way beneath his paws. He slid down, ending up on the ledge again. "But this is the way the other cats went." Grey Wing could detect the sense too, although not with Jagged Peak's precision. Reaching his brother's side, he looked back, puzzled. At that moment a ray of moonlight pierced the cloud cover, revealing a yawning gap behind them where the path had completely slipped away. "Look at that!" he exclaimed, feeling his legs shake at the thought of what might have happened. "If it wasn't for your tracking skills, we would have fallen." Jagged Peak's eyes shone with pride, and he headed along the trail even more confidently. Soon the young cat's paw steps began to falter. Grey Wing's own legs ached, and his sore pad was troubling him again. Jagged Peak must have been exhausted. "We've done enough," Grey Wing meowed. "We need to rest now. I'm sure we'll catch up with the others tomorrow." Jagged Peak opened his jaws to argue, then sighed. "I am pretty tired," he confessed. Together the two cats curled up at the side of the path beneath an overhanging rock. Jagged Peak fell asleep almost at once, his whiskers twitching as if he was still following the scent trail in his dreams. Grey Wing dreamed that he was back in the cave, with sheltering walls around him and the roof lost in shadows. The murmuring voices of other cats were all around him. "It's time we were moving off again," Shaded Moss meowed. "First, we should hunt," Clear Sky objected. "My belly thinks my throat's clawed out." "Whatever, just wake up Moon Shadow first," Turtletail added. More voices joined the debate. Grey Wing wondered vaguely why all the cats he could hear were the ones who had left the cave to follow the sun trail. He opened his eyes to see the sun beginning to rise above the mountaintops, with wisps of cloud scattered across a pale blue sky. His jaws parted in a huge yawn and he stretched his stiff limbs, daunted by the thought of another day plodding through the snow. Then he realized that he could still hear the voices from his dream. The mewing of several cats reached his ears, and then Clear Sky's voice, raised clearly. "Well, Shaded Moss, we're seeing the sun at last. It should be easier traveling today." Jagged Peak. Jagged Peak. Grey Wing leaped to his paws, weariness forgotten, and prodded his little brother in the ribs. "The others are here." Jagged Peak stared at him for a moment, his blue eyes still confused by sleep, then bounced up to stand beside him. "What are we waiting for?" With Grey Wing in the lead, they raced along the ledge and around a corner, their paws skidding on the hard snow. "I've found their scent," Jagged Peak announced excitedly. At the same moment Grey Wing spotted the traveling cats a short way down the slope, milling around a hollow tree trunk. The first rays of the sun were just reaching them. More cats were emerging from inside the trunk, arching their backs for a good long stretch. Then Bright Stream looked up and let out a yowl. "Look, it's Grey Wing and Jagged Peak." The rest of the cats followed her gaze, then bounded toward the newcomers. "Grey Wing." Turtletail was one of the first to reach them. "It's really you. I can't believe this," Clear Sky exclaimed, joy in his eyes, as all the cats crowded around the two newcomers. "I thought I'd never see you again." "You did well coming all this way by yourselves," Tall Shadow added. "But what are you doing here?" Shaded Moss asked. The first astonished mews of welcome died away, and Grey Wing saw some of the cats exchange flickering glances of anxiety. "Is all well in the cave?" Bright Stream asked. "Is Quiet Rain okay?" Clear Sky added. "Every cat is fine," Grey Wing reassured them. Jagged Peak stepped forward, puffing his chest out proudly. "I came to find you," he announced. "I voted to leave, remember? Then Grey Wing came after me." "Oh, so you just set off on your own?" Clear Sky meowed, giving his little brother a friendly shove. "Why am I not surprised? You took a huge risk, and you're very lucky that Grey Wing found you." "I know," Jagged Peak admitted with a glance of gratitude. Then he let out a gleeful meow and added, I had to rescue him too. That's true, Grey Wing mewed. He turned to Clear Sky. And how are all of you? We're fine, his brother replied. The blizzard slowed us down, but we're pretty sure we're heading in the right direction. We climbed right up to the top, Grey Wing reported, gesturing with his tail. From up there, we could see land beyond the mountains. It's still a long way off, but you'll see it once you've crossed this next ridge. That's great, Clear Sky exclaimed, his eyes gleaming. We need to get moving as soon as we can, Shaded Moss meowed, glancing around and gathering the rest of the cats around him with a wave of his tail. Just as soon as we've eaten, Moon Shadow put in. As he spoke, Grey Wing spotted Quickwater and Jackdaw's Cry toiling up the slope, dragging a snow hare between them. Great catch! Shaded Moss praised them as they reached the group and let their prey drop, blinking in surprise when they spotted Grey Wing and Jagged Peak. All the cats gathered around to share the prey. Turtletail sat beside Grey Wing, pressing herself close to him. I'm so glad you changed your mind, she murmured. Grey Wing looked around at the other cats, sensing their excitement. I'm glad too, he mewed.